Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great day to be alive, and to any of my Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters in the audience, es un gran día, parte estar vivo. It is an absolute honor to be here with all of you for another impactful installment of our Beyond Buzzwords speaker series. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, along with about 200 others, including several large groups and workplaces watching this together. This series has become a cornerstone of Metro United Way's equitable community work as we hope to turn meaningful conversations into actionable change, and today's event exemplifies that commitment. My name is Robert Earl Gunn Jr. I'm the proud Chief Equity and Impact Officer at Metro United Way, where we work to ensure that the greater Louisville region has thriving kids, strong households, and an equitable community. I'm happy to welcome you to this space where we tackle critical issues and explore pathways toward a more equitable community. As a former teacher and principal, I'm excited about today's discussion. This conversation holds special significance as we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, an educator, scholar, and thought leader whose work has transformed the way we think about race, identity, and education in America. Dr. Tatum's insights are deeply aligned with our focus at Metro United Way on creating thriving kids as a foundation for stronger households and an equitable community. We know that when our kids thrive, our entire community benefits. That's why Metro United Way works tirelessly to ensure every child in our 7-county region has access to the opportunities and resources they need to succeed. Whether it's early learning initiatives, support for young folks with mental health, or engaging families in their child's educational journey, we are committed to building a brighter future for every child, no matter their zip code or background. But we cannot do this work alone. Equity is at the heart of everything we do. I will repeat, equity is at the heart of everything we do, and it requires intentionality, collaboration, and action. That's why events like Beyond Buzzwords are so critical, and they provide us the opportunity to hear from leaders like Dr. Tatum and reflect on how we can all be part of the solution. I want to take a moment to acknowledge our partners who have made this possible, including the LG&E Foundation. Their continued support ensures that we can continue to elevate these important conversations and inspire action that leads to real change. As we begin today's discussion, I encourage you to think about the children and families in our community who rely on our collective efforts to shape a successful future for everyone. Together, we can move beyond buzzwords and create lasting, meaningful impact. It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce Mr. Lonnie Ballar, Senior Vice President of Engineering and Construction, PPL. And Lonnie, you are muted, my good brother.
Let me try it there. How's that? Is that better?
You got
All right. Thanks, Robert. Appreciate the opportunity for LG&E KU to host these conversations. As you said, very important community conversations that we need to continue to have. And so on to the introduction. Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And other conversations about race as well. And can we talk about race and other conversations in an era of school resegregation? An award-winning psychologist, widely known for her expertise on race relations and as a thought leader in higher education, she is the president emerita of Spelman College. Her 13 years as the president of Spelman College were marked by innovation and growth, and her visionary leadership was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. In spring 2017, she was the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor at Stanford University. Most recently, she served as interim president of the Mount Holyoke College during academic year 2022-2023. The combination of her expertise and her engaging conversational style has made Tatum a sought-after speaker on the topic of higher education leadership, strategies for creating inclusive campuses and work environments, and the impact of race in the classroom. Dr. Tatum holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University, an MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan as well as an MA in Religious Studies from Hartford International Universities. She was the 2014 recipient of the American Psychological Association Award for Outstanding Lifetime Contributions to Psychology. She'll be joined today by Trent Finley, which many of you know, Director of Equity Community at Metro United Way, who provides oversight for Metro United Way's strategic direction to infuse an equity lens throughout our internal and external work. So all please join me in welcoming guest speaker Dr. Tatum and moderator Trent Finley. Sorry, Trent.
Thank you. Thank you, Lonnie. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Beyond Buzzwords speaker series. I'm Trent Finley, Director of Equitable Community here at Metro United Way, and I have the incredible honor of moderating this conversation today with Dr. Beverly Tatum. As you heard, Dr. Tatum is a renowned psychologist, educator, thought leader whose groundbreaking book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, has shaped national conversations about race, identity, and systemic inequities. Her work continues to be a vital resource for educators, parents, and community leaders seeking to foster inclusive spaces where all students can thrive. So today, we'll dive into her insights on race, identity, and education, discussing how we can take meaningful action to create a more equitable future. We'll have time for audience questions toward the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Dr. Tatum, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start by reflecting on the impact of your work over the years. So your book was first published in 1997 and has been since updated to reflect the evolving conversation on race. How has the understanding of race and identity changed over the years, and what challenges persist today?
Well, thank you, Trent. And let me just say thank you to the United Way for inviting me and making this conversation possible. I'm looking forward to our time together. I appreciate your asking me about, how my thinking has evolved in this way, because when I wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, initially it was published in the 90s, 1997. Fast forward 20 years, as I was wrapping up my time at Spelman College as president, I decided to update the book for its re-release in 2017. And when I did that, I was thinking about what had changed since 1997 to 2017. What had changed in the United States and the world, in our environment, what had changed for the students, the young people that I had gotten to know while working at Spelman versus the students I'd had in the 90s. The students I had in the 90s are now, middle-aged, right? But the students who I call the 21st century students, the 21st century coming of age in this century, had a different perspective that I thought we needed to lift up. So to just say a little bit about that shift, one of the things that probably everyone is aware of, but maybe we don't think about all the time, is that our population has shifted a lot. So to just use as an example, I was born in the 50s, 1954. In 1954, the US population was 90% white, 10% everybody else. Not 10% Black, but 10% Black, Latino, Asian, Native, 90% white, and everybody else made up that other 10%. If we fast forward to today, the adult population is not 90% white, it's more like 2/3, 66%, something like that. And the Black population is about 12 or 13%. The Latino population is the largest population of color now, approaching 20%, not quite. The Asian population, Asian American population, is growing rapidly at about 6%. Even though it's small, it's the fastest growing population, largely the result of immigration. The population that we would today call multiracial, people who identify with one or more racial groups, more than one racial group, that population was at one time about 1%. Today it's approaching 10% among young people. So all of this is to say our population is much more diverse than it was today. And I was talking about the adult population. If we talk about the population of people under the age of 18, children, what we know is that the youth population is now about 50%, maybe slightly more of color, right? So we know that we're headed toward a place where there'll soon be more people of color in the young population if there than there will be white people. And that shift in the population has generated a lot of political anxiety. And we see that in the conversations about immigration. We hear that when President Trump talks about wanting to send people back to countries of color, wondering why people from Europe don't want to come, as in, why can't we get some more white people over here? That language is part of the popular conversation. And it's a consequence of our shifting demographic. And why has our population shifted so much? Some of it's related to demographics. Some of it is also due to birth rates. It happens that the older white population is having fewer children, or has had fewer children, while the younger populations of color are having more children, as well as the flow of immigration. We also know that our politics has shifted, right? When I wrote my book back in 97, Bill Clinton was the president. Fast forward 20 years, when it came out in 2017, Donald Trump was the president. But if you were a young person born in the early 2000s or in the late 1990s, most of your childhood, 8 years of it, President Obama was the president. So growing up with a Black president and seeing a Black family in the White House is a very different experience than the one I had when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. Not barely seeing Black people on television, never mind in political office. So that has shifted how people think about identity or about racism, because there are a lot of people who will say, well, it's not, racism's not a problem anymore. We had a Black president. We don't need to focus on these questions. Some people are saying we shouldn't focus on these questions. We shouldn't talk about these things. And the problem is that we've been talking too much. I, of course, don't agree with that. And I'm sure we'll talk about why. But the psychology I taught a course for many years on which my book is largely based, called The Psychology of Racism. And when we look at the psychology of racism in 1997 versus the psychology of racism in today, 2025, it's not that different. And one of the things that remains the same that I think is really important for today's conversation to acknowledge is that people still find it very hard to talk about. Many people struggle with being in a room, particularly a racially mixed room. Our participants today are on Zoom, but if we were all in a room together, there would be, I'm sure, some hesitation about asking a question, about making a statement, for fear that you might offend or for fear that it might be perceived in a way other than what you intended. That kind of fear and anxiety is very, very common. It was very, very common in the 90s. It's very, very common now. And I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes, if we could take a couple of minutes, talking about the roots of that anxiety, because I think it's important to understand and acknowledge. Particularly since I know some of our conversation is going to be focused on children, dealing with kids and families and in schools. I think it's important to ground ourselves in that childhood experience. So I'd like our audience, I'm sorry I can't see them, but I'd like our audience to think about their own earliest race-related memory. If we were all in the same room together, I would ask people to raise their hands if they've thought of something. My experience is, and I guess we could do that. I don't know if you could see hands raised via the digital tool on Zoom. But if you were to ask people to raise their hands if they thought of something, most people would raise their hands pretty quickly. Yes, I've thought of something. And then if you ask people to tell you, as I often do when I'm in live audiences, to tell you what age they were at the time of the thing they remembered, many people would raise their hands and say, I was 5, I was 6, I was 7. Somebody might say I was 15 in high school. Someone might say I was in college. But most people will remember something that happened in childhood, sometimes as young as 3 or 4, but mostly around the age of first or second. Oh, someone has put in the chat, I was 12. There's a wide range. Many people will remember something as early as 3 or 4. I've seen somebody has put that in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of 5s, 7s, first grade. Here's what I want you to now think about. My sense from what I've just seen is that this audience is like most. Most people have a memory that goes back to their childhood, and usually like kindergarten, first grade. And the next question I like to ask is what feeling is attached to that experience? If people were typing in the chat, and you could do that, they might type in words like somebody typed happy. And that is not uncommon, but more often you see confusion, puzzled, shame, anger. Somebody put wonder, hurt, confused. A lot of confusion. Confusion is probably the most common word I hear. Confusion, ashamed, embarrassed, sometimes curiosity, sometimes love or happiness. It could be a happy memory that you have, but confused is very, very common. Now, the next question is, did you talk to anybody about it? At the time that it happened, did you talk to a parent or a teacher or maybe an older sibling? I'm seeing I did not. Some people said I talked to my mom. Afterwards, no, 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 probably not. A lot of no's. When I ask this question in a large group, I just ask people to raise their hands. Raise your hand if you spoke to someone about your experience at the time that it happened. A few hands will go up, but most people will say no. They'll shake their heads, no, I did not talk about it. Now, I want to ask this audience again, and people are saying, I never told anyone, didn't talk about it. Some people did tell parents or teachers, but if we could do a graph of the answers we got in the chat, it would be most people did not have that conversation. But if you think about the 6-year-olds you know, I bet there are a lot of parents or teachers, people who have had experience with 6-year-olds. If you think about 6-year-olds, one of the things I can tell you about them is they tend to be pretty chatty. They tend to, say whatever's on their minds. They don't filter themselves the way older children do. And so if you have a room full of adults who had an experience they still remember years and years later, and they remember it as confusing or upsetting in some way, and they didn't talk to anybody about it, you have to ask the question, why not? And the answer really is because by the time you're 6 or 7 or, whatever the age that was, you probably have already learned either through observation or direct experience that adults don't want you to talk about this. This is a topic that adults don't want to touch. Maybe you were a kid at 3 or 4 who observed something. The example I often give, and as an example in my book, is like being in a grocery store. Let's imagine a white child in a grocery store seeing a Black person up close in the grocery aisle, maybe for the first time. If they live in a segregated neighborhood, it hasn't been their experience. And they say in that loud 3-year-old voice, Mommy, why is that person so dark? And what does mommy do? The first thing she probably does is shh, try to hush the child because it's an embarrassing moment and you don't know for sure what to say. But to the extent there are things you could say because people come in different colors. Just like hair is dark, some hair is light, skin is the same way. It doesn't have to be a big deal conversation, but most people will go first to silence. Let's silence that conversation. And if we understand that people learn to be silent about the conversation from an early age, it is not surprising that then when they're adults, they don't want to talk about it in the classroom. They don't want to talk about it at work. They don't want to talk about it in places where talking about it might actually be helpful because they had so deeply internalized that taboo against having that conversation. That was true in 1997. It's still true.
So, Dr. Tatum, one of the core themes in your book is racial identity development,
Yes.
which you've already touched on, particularly among young people. Um, why do students of the same race often sit together in schools, and how can educators create environments that encourage meaningful cross-racial interactions?
Well, let's talk about that phenomenon of kids sitting together in schools. Um, it's it's not a phenomenon you're going to observe in a racially segregated school, right? If all the kids are Black, of course they're all sitting together, right? But if it's a racially mixed school, or a largely white school with a smaller Black population, or it doesn't have to be just Black kids, small Latino population, small Asian population, but is probably most often commented about when we're talking about Black children. If it's a school like that and it's an elementary school, let's say first grade, second grade, you're not going to see the kind of separation you see in middle school and in high school in those early elementary years. Often, you will see kids in early elementary, let's say first, second, third grade. They're all in one classroom together, same homeroom. They're not moving from room to room. They're all in a classroom together. They're having their recess together. They're having their lunch together. They may be socializing outside of school together. But as they get older, as they move into middle school, they may be going to school further from home. They may be being bused. They may be going to school outside of their neighborhood. And they're likely to be in different classes for English, different classes for math, different classes, for language arts. And all of that happens in the context of the term I'm going to use is tracking, ability grouping, where kids are separated in terms of where they fall in the academic hierarchy. And in many schools, that means Black kids are more likely to be at the lower end, and white kids more often in the upper end, the honors class, level one, they all have different names. So there's separation that happens structurally in the school, but it's also a time when kids are approaching adolescence. And when you become an adolescent, certain things happen to you physically. Obviously, you get taller, your body parts start to change. If you're a girl, you start to develop your breasts, your hips, all of that. Boys' voices start to change. There's all that physical stuff that's happening, but there's also brain changes. As your body's changing, your brain is also maturing. And as your brain is maturing, you're able to think about the world you live in more sophisticated, more complicated ways. And one of those ways is to think about who you are and where you belong and how other people perceive you. You think about that in ways that maybe you weren't when you were 6 years old or 7 years old. And that's when racism starts to really become part of your understanding. Why is that? Well, maybe because you're going to the mall, and when you're at the mall, you notice people follow you around, or accuse you of maybe trying to shoplift, or maybe you notice. If I'm going to use a Black male example for a moment, maybe you notice as you're getting bigger, when you're walking down the sidewalk, people cross the street to avoid you. You might notice that when you're passing by someone's car, you hear the click of the door lock. You might start to pick up cues about how you are being perceived by other people. And that leads you to start thinking about, well, who am I? And how do people see me? And what should I be in the world? And, as your understanding of that expands, you're trying to figure all that stuff out. Now, maybe you have white friends. Maybe you had white friends from elementary school, and you're still friends with those people, but they're not having the same experience as you are. And if you are having those experiences and your friends, your white friends are not, they may not understand exactly what's going on with you as you start to respond. You start to have feelings about how people are perceiving you. But your black male friend in your math class is having the same experience. And so when you leave math together, maybe you go sit together because you're having a shared experience. You are having a connection that is increasingly important to you in adolescence, more important to you when you are 13 than when you were 5. That connection starts to really matter. Now, it is possible for kids to not separate in that way. But that often requires being in an environment that's really encouraging kids to engage with one another, creating opportunities to work together on projects where they really get to know each other, creating opportunities where they're bringing kids together as opposed to structuring separation. Schools often are structuring separation through tracking, through the way assignments are being done, through the way discipline is being managed. There's a lot of ways in which separation is fostered and encouraged, and students respond to that too.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tatum. So you've written extensively about how systemic racism influences educational outcomes. Can you elaborate on how these systems operate and specific barriers they create for students of color?
Sure. I want to maybe paint a big picture, if I might, about this. I often talk about what I call the ABCs. A stands for affirming identity, B stands for building community, C stands for cultivating leadership. And I hope you'll see quickly how this connects to your question. Um, A, affirming identity, speaks to the fact that we all want to feel seen, heard, and understood, particularly in those parts of our lives where we may feel marginalized or invisible, overlooked. I like to use as an analogy the illustration of a photograph. Let's imagine, we have to really imagine this, but let's imagine we were all in the same room together, right? Everybody on the Zoom call, we were all in the same auditorium together, and someone took a group photo. Technically, we could do this if we all had everybody on the same Zoom screen, we could take a screenshot. But let's imagine we're all together in person and someone takes a photograph. Each of us gets a copy of that group shot. I'm going to ask you, Trent, what's the first thing that you're going to do when you get your copy of that photograph?
I'm going to find myself on it.
That's right. You're going to look for yourself. That's the only answer. If you were wondering if that was the right answer, that is the right answer. Each of us would get that photograph, and the first thing each of us would do would be to try to find ourselves in it, right? I was sitting right next to Trent. Where am I in that picture? But let's imagine that before we got our copy of the photo, someone decided to randomly remove some of the people from the photograph. And let's imagine, Trent, you were one of those people. Let's imagine you get the photograph. You're looking for yourself. You were standing right next to me. You spot me in the picture, but where you were, there's no picture. Like you're just not there. You would wonder. I mean, it's possible to do that with digital technology. We can remove people from photographs, but you would look at that picture and you would wonder, what's wrong with this picture? But let's imagine this happened repeatedly. Every time there was a United Way event, every time you were standing in that photo, every time your picture was removed for reasons unknown to you. After a while, you wouldn't say, "What's wrong with that picture?" After a while, you would say, "What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me that I am never included in this picture? What's wrong with me that, I was there, I remember being there, and yet for some reason, someone keeps taking me out of the photo?" That would make you feel bad, right? It would certainly make you feel like I don't want to participate in that picture taking activity anymore. I'm never in the picture, why participate? School is like a big photograph. We step into that photograph and we want to be seen in it. We want to be able to find ourselves in it. And we want to be able to find ourselves in it. Not let's imagine you found yourself in the picture. The next thing you would do is evaluate how you look, right? You don't want to just be in the picture. You want to be in the picture looking good. And so, you would say, "Oh no, my eyes were closed. Oh, I wasn't smiling, or I was smiling too much." Whatever it was, you would evaluate how you looked in the picture. In the same way, children come to school looking for themselves in the picture. If they find themselves in the picture, then they want to know, how do I look in that picture? How do people like me look in that picture? When we think about racism and how it operates in schools, one of the way racism operates is to erase people from the picture. When Black kids show up and they don't see themselves in the curriculum, they don't see themselves in the books that they're being asked to read, they don't see themselves in the stories being told, in the films being shown, in the posters on the wall. If they don't see themselves, or they don't see themselves looking good, they might see themselves, but maybe they see themselves, in the For Wanted posters, you know what I mean? Or they see themselves in the I used to teach child psychology. You can find pictures of Black kids in the child development text, but sometimes they're in the section of the book that deals with delinquency or that deals with deviance in some way. That's not in the picture looking good, right? So when kids feel invisible, they're less motivated. They don't have a sense of belonging. They feel invisible. Invisibility is not conducive to motivated learning. So we want to think about, how can we affirm the identities of all the kids? You feel affirmed when you see people who look like you in the classroom teaching. You feel affirmed when you see people who look like you in the textbook, when you hear about the stories that relate to your experience. But when you don't, you start to feel invisible. So the first thing that we can think about in terms of what to do is to ask ourselves, who's missing from the picture? What can we do about that? How do we bring people back into focus? There's that. So then there's B. The B in the ABCs, that was the A, affirming identity. The B, building community, is related. We know, psychologists know, that a sense of belonging is very important. It's like the most important, it's one of the most important predictors of persistence. What keeps kids from dropping out? If they feel like they belong in school, they don't quit school. If they feel like they are part of a family and part of community where they are valued and appreciated, they want to be there. They want to be there. They want to contribute to that. They like the good feeling that comes from that sense of belonging is very, very important. If you go to most schools and read the rhetoric on the walls or hear the principal talk or the teachers talk, people talk about belonging a lot. But if what we do to help create a sense of belonging has not been informed by the A, affirming identity, we are often doing it in a way that leaves people out. For example, let's say we're having a group meeting, an information meeting for parents about how to help your kids succeed in school. And if there are a large group of parents who are not English speakers, and we don't provide the materials in their first language, it's a community building activity to invite them. But if you didn't think about how to really include them in the affirming of identity, you may find they don't participate. or they come and don't feel like they belong and don't stay. Um, the building of community requires the affirming of identity. You have to do them both together in order to really do it successfully. And then the C, cultivating leadership, is an acknowledgement that the skill of A and B may not necessarily be part of somebody's toolkit. If you grew up in segregated environments, if you haven't had much opportunity to practice affirming identity and building community, you might not do it very well at first. And you might need some help. You might need, a peer teacher to help you do it, or a principal to guide you, or some professional development. You might need some help getting there. But if we understand that in order to be an effective leader, whether that's a classroom leader, a school leader, a peer leader, a family leader, and we're all leading somebody somewhere. In order to be an effective leader, you have to know how to engage with people whose life experience is different from your own. Racism has the effect of telling us, I don't need to learn about your experience. Your experience doesn't matter. Only the experiences of these people matter. If you're not one of these people, I don't have to pay attention. I don't need to think about it. But that, of course, is a flawed logic. If we want our society to be successful, if we want all our kids to be successful, if we want to thrive, we have to pay attention to everyone, which brings us back, of course, to the A.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Tatum, for such an insightful discussion so far. As a reminder, everyone, if you have questions for Dr. Tatum, please use that Q&A function, and we will get to those questions in just a few minutes. Dr. Tatum, at Metro United Way, our focus is on thriving kids, strong households, and an equitable community. What actionable steps can organizations like ours and other organizations in the community take to address systemic racism in local schools?
Well, one of the things that I think is really critical, now, every school has its own idiosyncrasies, right? Every community has its own particular history. And so I'm going to speak in a generic way, and you will think about how does this apply to my setting in Kentucky, right? But when we think generically, what we have to understand is that racism operates in a lot of different ways. You use the word systemic, and it does operate systemically, but it doesn't operate by itself systemically. There are individuals who are making decisions that either reinforce that system or interrupt that system, right? So if I am the principal of a school and I'm presented with curricula that came from, the state school board, and that state school board curriculum leaves a lot of people out. Is that my fault as the principal? I didn't create that curriculum. I didn't write those books, but now I'm in this situation. So I have the opportunity to take action in a way that will either reinforce the systemic racism that's represented by the omissions in that curriculum, or I can take action that interrupts it. Those are my choices. I can do nothing, reinforce it, or do something different to interrupt it. What might I do if I wanted to interrupt it? These are the books I have. I don't have a budget to buy more books. Well, I could work with my teachers to help. We could have a little, workshop together where we are looking at the text or the materials that we have available, and we can ask ourselves the question, who's missing from the picture in these textbooks? What do we see missing? Will our children see themselves positively represented? Some kids will, some kids won't. If we recognize that there's some kids who are systematically being removed from the photograph, what can we do to reinsert them in the photograph? Can we supplement with materials that are readily available through the library? Can we supplement with internet access Can we bring in community voices? Living history, people who could talk about, let's use the civil rights movement as an example. It's really quite shocking how little children of today learn about the civil rights history, which is not so long ago, right? I was born in 1954. I like to say I'm not that old. And things that happened in my lifetime are not being taught necessarily in schools. Kids are not getting that history. How do we bring it into the classroom through materials that we can create? How do we use the internet with our students? These would be older students, perhaps not, first graders, but middle school, high school students, to ask the question, class, let's look at what's missing. What resources can we find to correct what's missing in our texts, etc.? I mean, I'm brainstorming with you here as an example, but asking critical questions. What is the thing that we can do together to create a more inclusive, more welcoming, more affirming environment that will facilitate the academic and civic development of our students? We want our kids to thrive. What interferes with that thriving? Let's ask that question.
Absolutely. I love that photograph analogy. As we look ahead, Dr. Tatum, what gives you the most hope about the future of racial equity in education and beyond?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're sitting in a difficult moment right now, right? Um, the President of the United States just last week announced that there should be no focus on equity or diversity or inclusion, which is an interesting statement. We know, I know, maybe I should say I know, I believe that the way in which the term DEI has been weaponized as something bad is really problematic. But let's undo it for a moment. D stands for diversity. E stands for equity. I stands for inclusion. If you don't want diversity, what you're saying is you want homogeneity. We don't have a homogeneous society. So you can't get homogeneity unless you're leaving out parts of your society on purpose, right? Equity, the opposite of equity is inequity. Do we want inequity? We have inequity. If we want to strive toward equity, we have to take action that moves us in that direction. We can't just say equity is a bad thing. Why would we say that? We know that inequity leads to social unrest, ultimately, and that most people want to live in a society where there's a sense that people are all being treated fairly in a way that allows them to thrive. The I stands for inclusivity. What's the opposite of inclusivity? Exclusivity. Do we want to be exclusive? Do we want to exclude people? Certainly in the public education arena, it makes no sense to try to exclude students if you want to educate students. People have to feel as though they're included. So how do we get to, so I just want to acknowledge that we're in an environment where many people are overtly, publicly, powerful people are saying, we don't want equity, we don't want to include, we don't want diversity in our space, however that space is being defined. So that makes it harder. There's no question that that makes it harder, but it doesn't make it impossible. As I like to say, hard does not mean impossible. One of the ways that I think we can move forward together is to engage in conversation, acknowledging one of the reasons I started with that exercise that we just did, where we reflected on our early memories and acknowledged that many people have had an early history of being told not to talk about these things, is because if you acknowledge that at the beginning, these are hard conversations. Many people struggle with them, but we cannot fix a problem without talking about it. We cannot improve our students' academic experience in school without talking about the things that get in the way. We cannot improve life outcomes, access to early childhood education, whatever it is that the United Way is focused on, without talking about the barriers. I live in Georgia. I live in a state that makes early childhood education available, but there aren't enough slots for everyone. And those slots are not determined by need. They're kind of first come, first serve. Well, if you've got a car and resources, you're likely to be able to be first in line, right? Than if you had to take a bus to get there, as an example. Um, the we have to think about what are the unintended barriers that we create for people, and what are the ways we might address that. And that requires some creative thinking, but it also requires some courage because we know that there are people right now who will say, we don't want you talking about that. That is a challenge. But as I said, there are examples of very courageous educators who are still doing the work because they believe in it and making a difference for kids every day.
All right, Dr. Tatum, again, thank you. And just before we get to one or two audience questions, I want to ask you one last question here, and that is, if there's one takeaway you want today's audience to leave with, what would it be?
Do something. And I mean that, so, we all have a sphere of influence. I write about this in my book toward the end. One of the things I talk about is that everybody has a sphere of influence. Some people have a bigger sphere of influence than others. If you're president of the United Way, you've got a sphere of influence. If you are president of the United States, you've got a sphere of influence. But you could be a person who is currently unemployed, living at home, and still influence other people. Maybe those other people are people you meet and talk to when you're in church on Sunday. Maybe those are the people you talk to when you are connecting with friends on Facebook. We all have spheres of influence, and we need to think about how can I use my sphere of influence to move this conversation forward. Maybe I'm going to tell someone that I was on this Zoom call and I heard that analogy about the photograph, and that has made me start to think I should be asking in every meeting I enter, who's missing from this meeting? Who's missing from this picture? And what can I do about it? If there's some people I thought should have been in the room and aren't, how can I make sure next time they are there? That kind of taking responsibility for your sphere of influence and how you can use it, I think is really, really important.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Tatum, for such a rich and insightful discussion. We are going to take some questions from our audience.
Great.
I'm sorry. Oh, as a reminder, if you have a question for Dr. Tatum, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many as we can. If we don't get to your question today, feel free to email us at info@metrounitedway.org, and we'll do our best to follow up with you. Dr. Tatum, first audience question. It is a long one, but it's good. It says, we are 86% white non-Hispanic in our school. Since we have so few that identify differently, it can cause them to feel called out when they try to address inclusion. They often try to hide, but share with me they are not comfortable in the school. They mostly spread out across the student body without support from others and have similar experiences. They feel even more isolated and deal with microaggressions and racism daily. We started a club to help get them together and figure out how we can change the culture. Seems like an uphill battle, but for these students and all white staff trying to support them, suggestions on where to start.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think it is a great idea to create that opportunity for students to gather together, recognizing that there'll be some students who don't want to, right? There may be some students The phrase that was in the question was some students try to hide. If you are a minority student, and I'm using that word intentionally, if you're one of a few, that's what I mean by minority here. If you're one of a few and you're an adolescent, your primary goal is to fit in, right? Adolescents want to fit in. And if you think you can fit in best by not drawing attention to yourself or not drawing attention to your difference, that is not an uncommon strategy. But as the audience person alluded to, you might still, even if you're trying to like fit in, you may still find yourself the target of microaggressions, racist comments. Even people will say things, I've done a lot of research on the experiences of Black youth, particularly in predominantly white communities, and some of those Black teenagers who grew up in predominantly white communities will say people said things to me that were hurtful. They didn't probably mean it that way, but you just had to kind of let it roll off your back and not notice it, because if you brought it up, it would further isolate you. You didn't want to be isolated. But when there's an opportunity to gather with other people in a way that is supportive, that feels affirming, that's like a lifeline. Being able to gather together for a group project. Maybe, we're in the middle of Black History Month, maybe something related to that. It doesn't have to be that. I'm thinking right now of a young Black girl who was very isolated, depressed in her school, and one of her teachers, a white teacher, um, offered her the opportunity to participate in a musical group to sing. And she really enjoyed the singing, and some of the singing was from her culture as an African American, and that was even better. And all of it was very affirming, but she needed someone to invite her into that. The person who's inviting doesn't have to be a Black person. That people don't, mentors don't always have to match in that sense. It's great when they do. It's wonderful if you have that opportunity, but particularly in a school where the staff just doesn't match the student body, allies, the idea of being somebody's ally and acknowledging. I have two sons, they are adults now, but one of them was particularly shy in school. And he was in a classroom where he was the only Black kid in his class. And I remember his teacher at holiday time, during the winter holidays, around the time of Christmas, wanted to do something that helped everybody feel included. And she wanted to acknowledge the other December holidays, Hanukkah, but also Kwanzaa. And she wanted to ask my son about Kwanzaa, but she didn't want to put him on the spot. She didn't want to spotlight him and perhaps make him uncomfortable. So she called me as the mom, the parent, and she said, I want to talk to the kids about Kwanzaa. I don't know if you and your family celebrate Kwanzaa, but but if you do you think your son would want to talk about it? And I said, well, yes, we do celebrate Kwanzaa in addition to Christmas. And also, I don't know if he'd want to talk about it. I will ask him. And when I asked him if he would like to talk about Kwanzaa in his classroom, he was delighted to do it. He brought in some things from home that we use at Kwanzaa time, and he was spotlighted in a way that allowed him to feel empowered. What I appreciated was the teacher asked first. She didn't just spring it on him, right? She asked, and in that asking, gave him the chance to take some power in that situation. That's a small example, but it's the kind of thing that teachers who don't match the kids in terms of their race or ethnicity can still be allies by inviting them to participate in ways that feel comfortable to them.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Tatum, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom with us today. Your work continues to inspire action, and we're grateful for the opportunity to learn from you. So um, that's going to close out today's session. Um, Again, if you did not get your question answered, info@metrounitedway.org. I would like to reintroduce Metro United Way's Chief Equity and Impact Officer, Robert Gunn, for some final remarks.
Thank you very much, Trent. And certainly thank you, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, in listening and hearing everything that you shared today. Again, as I shared earlier, a former principal, a former teacher, so many things that you said resonated with me. Just to be a good audience participant, you asked us to think about that first interaction with race. I know for a fact I was 5 years old. My father and I were delivering Easter bunnies, chocolate Easter bunnies, to classmates. And I will never forget, I was walking, I will not say her last name, but her first name was Judy. My father and I were walking up to Judy's house. Her father was on a ladder. Judy came up and gave me a hug. And I will never forget, Dr. Tatum, her daddy fell off that ladder.
Oh no.
I don't know what his thoughts were, and it could have just been by happenstance, but the way he fell from that ladder and the way that he ran towards me and my father certainly gave me the indication that something with that interaction between his daughter and myself wasn't quite right. Of course, as you all can see, I'm an African American male. Judy was a Caucasian female. So my father had a conversation with me on the way home about what that entire interaction could have potentially been about. But just jog my memory there. Thank you as well for sharing your ABCs: affirming identity, building community, and cultivating leadership. Again, very powerful words. So thank you very much. And for our audience, if you want to learn more about Dr. Tatum's incredible work, please visit her website at beverlydanieltatum.com, spelled exactly like you'll see her name on the screen. I want to say thank you for everyone for participating today and all who have donated towards our DE&I initiatives. As I said at the beginning, here at Metro United Way, we are standing on the value of equity and embracing equity to make sure that everyone in our community has that sense of belonging and has what they need to be able to not just survive, but to thrive. Speaking of talking about some of the systemic things that we faced and seen over the course of the history of our country, Metro United Way is hosting a free racial wealth gap simulation. This simulation takes individuals and organizations on a historical journey through wealth building in America. We highlight 13 federal policies that have significantly impacted progress based on race. This has been one of our most powerful programs. The wonderful Mr. Trent Finley, he is often our main facilitator and leader of this initiative. So please engage with us. We have two events coming up. February 26th, that racial wealth gap simulation is at capacity. So we wanted to offer another opportunity, and that will be Thursday, February 27th from 11:30 to 1 p.m. It is a virtual convening and space is limited. So if you're interested, please go to our website right now at metrounitedway.org and you can search for racial wealth gap simulation and you will be able to get signed up. Last but not least, backed by popular demand, our next Beyond Buzzwords will focus on awareness to accountability with Dr. Robin DiAngelo to discuss her book, Nice Racism: How Progressive White People Perpetrate racial harm. That's going to be Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025. And also on September the 30th, we will have Dr. Jamar Tisby, author of the book, The Spirit of Justice, joining us. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I wish everyone a great day. Thank you again to Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, and everyone have a great day. We appreciate your time and your support. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.